you have allergy, it's a three-pronged approach currently, and it involves first and foremost avoidance. For instance, if somebody has dust mite allergies, they want to use dust mite covers for their bedding. The second prong of the approach is pharmaceuticals, pharmacotherapy, and that involves things like antihistamines, nasal steroids. And the third part of the approach